It had been another long day. The alarm had gone off too early, the morning had been rushed, and the hours at work had dragged on like a never-ending river. Everywhere, there were notifications, emails, and messages that demanded immediate attention. Every task seemed urgent, every sound distracting, and the weight of responsibilities felt heavier than ever. By the time the evening came, exhaustion had settled in like a thick blanket, and the mind refused to stop racing. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the streetlights outside. But even in this silence, the thoughts kept spinning plans, worries, things left undone. Sitting on the couch, staring at the wall, it felt as though the brain was stuck in a loop it could not escape. There had to be a way to calm the storm inside. Scrolling through a phone, looking for anything that might help, a suggestion popped up. Classical music. At first, it seemed strange. Classical music. Wasn't that something people listened to in old movies or fancy events? How could it help someone who barely had a moment to breathe? But in desperation, with nothing else working, it seemed worth a try. A piece by a composer named Bach appeared first. Tentatively, it was pressed play. The soft, flowing notes began, gentle yet deliberate, filling the room with sound. At first, it was just noise like any other. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the body began to respond. The shoulders, tense and tight, started to loosen. The chest felt lighter, and the rush of thoughts slowed down just a little. Sitting there, eyes closed, the music seemed to create a space apart from the day's chaos. It was as if each note carried a tiny weight away, a whisper telling the mind that it could rest. It was not instant magic, not a sudden miracle, but a gentle easing, a soft push toward calm. A realization came quietly: this simple music might be exactly what was missing all along. Curiosity grew. The person leaned forward, searching for more pieces, more melodies that might continue this strange, comforting experience. Mozart's compositions appeared next, light and airy, sometimes playful, sometimes somber. Each note seemed to touch a different corner of the mind, inviting focus, clarity, or gentle reflection. With every piece, a small transformation occurred, subtle but noticeable. The tension of the day began to unravel, and a sense of peace, quiet and deep, started to take root. It wasn't just relaxation, it was connection. Each composition told a story without words, spoke in emotions, and held a rhythm that felt natural. Sitting alone in the quiet apartment, it felt as if the music understood what words could not. The simple act of listening became a bridge between a hectic, noisy world and a calmer, clearer mind. By the end of the evening, the world outside had not changed. Responsibilities still awaited, but something inside had shifted. There was a calmness now, a space where thoughts could breathe, a quiet room in the mind where stress could not reach. For the first time in a long while, it felt possible to rest without guilt, to sit still without the mind racing, to feel at peace with the simple act of listening. The next day, the routine began again, but now there was something new. The music was no longer a stranger, no longer just a suggestion on a screen. It became a companion, a quiet guide through the noise, a small refuge that could be returned to any time. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a habit began to form, one that promised a new rhythm to life, a chance for calm even in the busiest, most chaotic moments. The next morning began differently. There was still the usual rush, the constant pull of obligations, and the weight of responsibilities, but something inside felt lighter. The soft melodies from the previous evening lingered in the mind, like a quiet echo reminding that calm was possible. The day started not with tension, but with curiosity. What else could these simple notes do? During breakfast, the phone rested on the table, and without hesitation, a new composer was searched for. Debussy's name appeared first, unfamiliar, but intriguing. The first notes drifted through the small kitchen, delicate and flowing. It was like the music had its own heartbeat, subtle yet persistent, and it seemed to wrap around the mind like a gentle wind. With each passing second, thoughts slowed, and the chaos of yesterday's fatigue felt distant. It was not just relaxation anymore. It was discovery. Each composition was like a small window into a world that felt untouched by stress. The music carried feelings that words could not fully capture: lightness, wonder, sadness, joy, all within a few notes. It was mesmerizing, and the listener found themselves paying attention in a way that was rare in everyday life. The focus was soft, effortless, yet deep, as if the mind itself had learned to breathe alongside the rhythm by the afternoon. Work tasks were no longer just a blur of notifications. The background hum of the office, the constant chatter, and the repetitive typing on keyboards were still there, but the listener carried an invisible shield of calm. Classical music had taught a quiet lesson. Focus did not always need tension. Productivity could coexist with peace. When returning home, the mind was not just tired, it was open, ready to receive more melodies, more experiences, more quiet beauty. Evenings became explorations. Hours could be spent moving from one composer to another, each piece a new world to enter. The slow, deliberate piano of Chopin evoked reflection and thoughtfulness, while the orchestral swells of Tchaikovsky inspired awe. With every shift in melody and tempo, emotions were stirred, and the mind felt a freedom that had not been known before. It was almost like meeting a friend who did not speak, but communicated through feeling, guiding thoughts and emotions gently, without force. This discovery did not remain a private indulgence for long. Conversations with colleagues and casual friends gradually included mentions of these musical experiments. "It helps me think" was often the simplest explanation. Sometimes others laughed, skeptical at first, but the listener didn't mind. The important part was personal, intimate, and effective. Classical music had become a tool not just for relaxation, but for understanding the rhythms of the mind, for building resilience against stress, and for nurturing creativity that had been dormant under pressure. More than that, the music sparked reflection. There were moments sitting quietly in the living room or on a park bench, noticing how life felt slower, more manageable. Decisions that had seemed urgent and overwhelming before now seemed easier to face. The melodies became companions in thought, gentle reminders that calmness could be chosen. Even when circumstances were chaotic, this stage of the journey was marked by learning. Not just learning the composers, not just learning the names of famous pieces, but learning the mind itself. Listening carefully to how each note affected emotions, how certain rhythms encouraged focus while others invited relaxation. The listener became aware of patterns in their own reactions. Classical music had turned into a kind of mirror, reflecting both the struggles and the strengths hidden beneath the surface. Days blurred into weeks. The habit deepened naturally, without force. Workdays became punctuated with short listening moments. Early mornings, long commutes, and quiet evenings all held a melody waiting to be heard. Life did not become simpler. Responsibilities still pressed in, challenges still arose. But there was a foundation now, a reliable source of balance, a reminder that no matter how loud the world became, there was always a space where peace could exist. By the end of this period, the transformation was subtle but profound. It was not dramatic or sudden. Friends noticed a calmer demeanor, less reactivity, and a patient approach to daily problems. The listener noticed mental clarity, creativity sparked in unexpected ways, and a deeper understanding of emotions. Classical music had become a silent guide, offering lessons in focus, relaxation, and peace without a single word, without pressure. Just through the simple beauty of sound, the days had settled into a new rhythm. Classical music had moved from being an experiment to a daily companion. Mornings were no longer rushed chaos, but gentle awakenings, with soft piano notes filling the air. Workdays, once filled with tension and scattered thoughts, became more manageable, guided by subtle background melodies that encouraged focus and calm. Evenings were no longer just a time to collapse into a chair, but moments of exploration, reflection, and quiet joy. Over time, the listener realized that music was not just an escape, but a tool for living differently. Tasks that had once seemed daunting could now be approached with patience and clarity. Cleaning the apartment, preparing meals or organizing paperwork became quieter, more mindful activities. The music offered a rhythm that aligned with the mind, making each moment feel lighter and less pressured. One afternoon, a particularly challenging project demanded focus and creativity. Normally, stress would have built up, thoughts racing, heart pounding. But this time, the listener put on a gentle orchestral piece and noticed a remarkable difference. The mind, rather than scattering, began to organize itself, ideas flowing naturally, solutions appearing more easily. It was as if the music had opened doors that stress had previously kept closed. It wasn't just work that changed. Social interactions began to shift subtly as well. Patience increased, irritability decreased, and the listener found themselves truly present in conversations. Friends noticed the change, asking if something had happened, if life had suddenly become easier. The answer was simple: music. The quiet practice of listening to carefully chosen classical pieces had begun to influence personality, behavior, and emotional responses. Integration of music into daily life became more intentional. Specific pieces were chosen for specific purposes. Gentle piano for early morning calm, flowing strings for deep focus, lively compositions for bursts of creativity, and soft nocturnes for winding down in the evening. Each choice was purposeful, creating a personal system for managing energy, focus, and emotional balance. It was a form of self-care that required no fancy tools. No expensive retreats, just attention, openness, and the willingness to listen. The transformation was not immediate or dramatic, but it was steady and reliable. Small victories accumulated over time, completing tasks without anxiety, navigating stressful situations with ease, experiencing moments of genuine calm in the midst of chaos. Music became a guide, a patient companion that offered support without judgment. Gently shaping the daily rhythm of life, even mundane activities took on a new quality. Walking through the park. The listener noticed details that had been ignored before: the way sunlight danced on leaves, the subtle movements of birds, the distant hum of life around them. The music sharpened perception and encouraged appreciation. Life became richer, not because circumstances had changed, but because the mind had learned to respond differently, to find balance, and to embrace moments fully. There were challenges, of course. Busy weeks, unexpected stressors, and moments of distraction sometimes interrupted the routine. But the listener had learned to return to the practice, to press play, and let the music guide the mind back to calm. Each return felt reinforcing, strengthening the habit and deepening its effects. Over time, music became a reliable anchor, a source of stability in a world that was often unpredictable and chaotic. The listener also began experimenting with live performances, attending concerts when possible. The experience of music in person added a new layer of depth. Vibrations in the hall, the subtle nuances of live instruments, the shared energy of an audience amplified the calming, focusing effects. It was a reminder that music was a living force, one that could influence not just the mind, but the body, emotions, and spirit in ways that recordings alone could not. Daily life, though still busy, began to feel more intentional. The listener found that decisions were clearer, mood steadier, and moments of joy more accessible. Music was no longer background noise. It was a companion, a guide, and a teacher. With each day, the listener gained more insight into how simple practices like choosing to engage with music thoughtfully could transform experiences, improve focus, and cultivate peace. The transformation reached beyond personal life. Friends, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances noticed changes. Calm energy, attentiveness, and a newfound patience became visible traits. Conversations shifted. Reactions softened. Interactions became more meaningful. Music, once a private refuge, had begun influencing life outwardly in ways that were subtle but profound. Weeks turned into months. Classical music was no longer just a habit. It was a part of identity. The listener had developed a keen understanding of how different compositions affected mood, attention, and energy. It was now possible to navigate stress with tools that were simple, accessible, and deeply effective. Life had not become easier in external terms, but internally, it had become steadier, more manageable, and filled with moments of quiet. Intentional joy. Life had changed in ways both visible and subtle. Classical music had become more than a daily habit. It was now a companion, a teacher, and a tool for navigating both stress and creativity. The listener had discovered how different compositions influenced mood, focus, and emotional balance, and they had learned to integrate music into every corner of their life. But as with all journeys, challenges appeared. Testing the stability and consistency of this new rhythm, there were days when work was overwhelming, when deadlines pressed in from every side, and when personal responsibilities seemed to pile up all at once. On such days, it was easy to forget the gentle routines that had been built, to skip the melodies that had become a sanctuary, and to slip back into old patterns of stress and distraction. The listener noticed these lapses immediately. The mind, left unattended, became restless again. Tension built in the shoulders, and anxiety crept back into thoughts. It's like a familiar shadow. It was during one particularly chaotic week that the listener realized the true value of the practice. A major project demanded attention. Family obligations loomed, and unexpected disruptions caused constant interruptions. Normally, this would have led to sleepless nights, irritability, and frustration. But this time, there was a conscious decision to return to the music, to allow it to guide the mind back into focus and calm, sitting quietly in the living room. The listener chose a piece that had always brought clarity and flow. As the first notes began, a remarkable transformation took place. The scattered thoughts slowly aligned, tension melted from the shoulders, and a sense of presence returned. It was as if the music created a corridor of calm, a space where chaos could not penetrate. The realization was profound. The practice was not about perfection or constant calm. It was about returning, over and over, to the tools that fostered balance and focus. This period also brought experimentation. Different tempos, instruments, and styles were explored with greater intention. Faster-paced orchestral compositions were used to energize and stimulate focus during heavy work sessions, while slow, melodic piano pieces encouraged reflection and emotional release during quiet evenings. The listener learned to observe how each piece influenced thoughts, emotions, and energy levels. Building an understanding of the mind's responses and preferences, challenges were not only external, but internal as well. Doubts sometimes arose. Was this really helping? Was it just a temporary distraction? But each return to music reinforced its effects, showing that the benefits were real, measurable, and cumulative. It was not magic, but consistent practice, a choice to engage mindfully with something that nurtured focus, peace, and emotional resilience. Outside the home, subtle changes began to manifest. Conversations with friends were calmer and more attentive. Meetings at work were approached with patience and clarity rather than stress-fueled urgency. Even in noisy, chaotic environments, the listener found ways to carry the internal rhythm established by music, maintaining focus and emotional balance despite external pressures. The practice had moved from private ritual to internalized skill, shaping behavior and perception in ways that were visible to others. This stage of the journey also brought insight into self-care. Classical music became not only a tool for focus, but a means of emotional nourishment. Moments of anxiety, fatigue, or frustration were met with intention, a chosen composition, deliberate listening, and gentle awareness. Each session created space for reflection, healing, and recentering. Over time, the listener began to notice a remarkable consistency. Stress could still arise, but recovery was faster, and calm could be accessed more reliably. There were also moments of joy and inspiration. Sitting by a window on a rainy afternoon, listening to a soft, flowing piano piece, the listener felt a profound sense of gratitude and connection. Simple experiences, breathing, noticing the rain, observing the movement of shadows, were enriched by music, turning ordinary moments into ones of presence and appreciation. Life had not become simpler, but it had become richer. The listener had learned to navigate the world not through escape, but through engagement, guided by sound, awareness, and intention. As weeks turned into months, the practice deepened further. The listener began to anticipate challenges, selecting music that prepared the mind for focus, creativity, or calm before situations arose. There was a growing sense of mastery, not over the external world, but over responses, energy, and attention. The music had become a teacher, demonstrating lessons in patience, rhythm, and emotional intelligence lessons that extended beyond the notes themselves into all areas of life. By the end of this period, the listener recognized a profound shift. Stress was no longer the default state. Focus was not forced, but natural. Emotional balance had become habitual rather than elusive. Classical music had created a framework for life, a consistent companion through chaos and calm alike, and a reminder that small, intentional practices could lead to transformation that was both deep and lasting. Time had passed, and what had once been a casual experiment with classical music had grown into a deep, transformative part of daily life. The listener no longer questioned whether the practice worked. It had become instinctive, a steady companion through the ups and downs of everyday existence. The calm, clarity, and focus that once felt fleeting were now part of a foundation that allowed life to be approached with purpose and balance. Each day began with intentionality. The first notes of a soft piano piece drifted through the room, carrying a sense of calm that lingered long after the music ended. The mind, which had once been constantly racing from one task to another, now moved with awareness, attending to each moment without unnecessary tension. Responsibilities were still present, challenges still arose, but the internal response had shifted profoundly. Stress was no longer automatic. Patience, clarity, and calm became habitual. During work, classical music was used as a tool for flow rather than escape. Tasks that once felt overwhelming were approached in segments, with attention and energy guided by subtle rhythms. Even during meetings or moments of external chaos, the listener could carry the internal rhythm created by music, maintaining focus and calm. Creativity flourished in this environment, as the mind was free to explore ideas without the weight of anxiety or distraction. Evenings were now times of reflection and enrichment. The listener would select pieces that invited contemplation or gentle joy, letting melodies guide thoughts and emotions. Small details of life, previously unnoticed: the movement of sunlight, the subtle sounds of nature, the rhythm of everyday activity, were observed and appreciated. Music had become a lens through which the ordinary could feel extraordinary. The influence of music extended beyond personal experience. Friends, family, and colleagues began to notice changes in demeanor, presence, and patience. Conversations became deeper, attentiveness increased, and interactions were infused with a quiet energy that drew others in. Music, once private and personal, had begun to shape outward behavior and relationships, demonstrating that transformation in one's inner life naturally influences the world around them. The listener also discovered that music could be a teacher of life's rhythms. Each composition carried lessons in patience, timing, and balance. Fast movements encouraged action, decisiveness, and energy. Slow, flowing pieces invited reflection, gentleness, and presence. By observing responses to different melodies, the listener became more aware of their emotions and patterns, learning not only how to manage stress, but also how to cultivate resilience, creativity, and emotional depth. Challenges still appeared, of course. Busy weeks, unexpected problems, and emotional turbulence sometimes disrupted the routine. But the listener had learned the importance of returning to practice, pressing play and letting music guide the mind back to calm. Each return reinforced the habit, strengthening both the effects and the understanding that small, consistent actions could create profound change. In time, the practice inspired a desire to share. Without fanfare or pressure, the listener curated playlists, recommended pieces, and gently encouraged others to experience the calming, focusing effects of classical music. The response was subtle but meaningful. Friends tried the music, noticed small improvements in mood and focus, and some even incorporated it into their own lives. The listener realized that transformation did not have to be solitary. It could ripple outward, touching others in ways both subtle and profound. The journey reached its fullest expression in moments of quiet reflection. Sitting in a favorite chair, listening to a long orchestral piece, the listener could feel a deep sense of connection to music, to self, and to life itself. The constant tension that had once dominated days was replaced by steady awareness. Creativity, joy, patience, and clarity had become companions rather than fleeting moments. Music had become a mirror, teacher, guide, and friend. The story of transformation was not about dramatic change or external achievements. Life was still full, busy, and sometimes stressful. Responsibilities remained. Challenges persisted. But the response had changed, and that was the true transformation. Through consistent engagement with classical music, the listener had discovered the capacity for calm focus, an emotional balance that had always existed within. The final realization was simple, yet profound. Peace was not something to be found externally. It was cultivated internally, one note at a time, one moment at a time. Classical music had provided the tools, the rhythm, and the guidance. It had created space for attention, presence, and reflection. Life was still life with its ups and downs, surprises, and demands, but now it was navigated with a sense of ease and awareness that made every moment richer, calmer, and more meaningful. By the end of this journey, the listener understood that this practice was not a temporary experiment or a hobby. It was a lifelong companion, a reliable source of calm, focus, and peace. The music had done more than soothe. It had transformed the approach to life itself, providing lessons, insights, and balance that would last forever. And in the quiet of the evening, as the last notes faded into silence, there was gratitude not only for the music, but for the transformation it had inspired, shaping a life of focus, calm, and enduring inner peace. The days had grown into months, and the routine with classical music had settled into something more profound than a habit, had become a way of life. The listener had long realized that the benefits of music went beyond relaxation or focus. It was now a guide for emotional balance, mental clarity, and meaningful connection to the world. Each note, each melody had shaped responses, reactions, and perception in ways that were subtle but lasting. Morning routines began with intention rather than obligation. The alarm still rang early, but instead of reaching for the phone with a sense of dread, the listener now reached for a piece that set the tone for the day. Gentle piano or soft strings created a calm energy, and the mind adapted, moving with patience, focus, and clarity. Tasks, whether simple or complex, were approached with awareness, guided by rhythms that had trained both attention and emotion. At work, the difference was undeniable. Projects that once caused stress now inspired engagement and creativity. Meetings were approached with presence rather than tension. Decisions were made with clarity rather than urgency. Even when deadlines loomed or unexpected challenges arose, the internal rhythm cultivated by music allowed the listener to maintain calm and focus. It was no longer a tool for occasional relief. It was a constant companion, shaping responses to life itself. Beyond productivity, the listener discovered the emotional depth that music could unlock. Certain pieces invited reflection, creating space for understanding past events, processing emotions, or releasing lingering tension. Others inspired joy or lightness, moments of playfulness and delight that had been rare in the past. Life, once a series of tasks and obligations, now felt rich and textured. Each moment accessible and fully experienced. The habit of mindful listening had also opened doors to empathy and connection. Observing the world became easier, noticing subtle details, expressions, and emotions that were once overlooked. Conversations deepened. Interactions became more attentive, less reactive. Music had taught lessons that extended beyond sound. It had taught patience, awareness, and a sensitivity to the flow of life around. Challenges, however, still appeared. Busy weeks, demanding responsibilities, and emotional turbulence tested the listener's consistency. There were times when skipping a session seemed easier, when stress tempted the mind back into old patterns. But each return to music reinforced the benefits, demonstrating that transformation was not about perfection, but about persistent practice. Small, repeated choices created a cumulative effect that built resilience, focus, and inner peace. The listener also explored live performances whenever possible. Experiencing music in a concert hall added layers of depth impossible to capture with recordings alone. The vibrations of instruments, the subtle nuances of performers, and the shared energy of an audience created an immersive experience that inspired awe, reflection, and gratitude. Music was no longer just a personal practice. It was a bridge to collective experience, reminding the listener of connection beyond the self. Over time, the listener began sharing music intentionally. Playlists were curated for friends or colleagues, recommendations offered gently, without pressure. The response was subtle, but meaningful. Others began to notice improvements in mood, focus, or calm, and some began integrating music into their own routines. The practice had expanded beyond individual transformation, influencing others in ways that were quiet but lasting. Life itself became a series of opportunities to engage intentionally. Simple moments making tea, walking in a park, sitting by a window were accompanied by awareness and reflection, enhanced by the presence of music. Ordinary experiences became extraordinary, not because circumstances had changed, but because the listener had changed in how they perceived, felt, and responded. Music had become a lens through which life was both understood and enjoyed. By this stage, the listener's internal landscape had shifted completely. Stress no longer dominated the mind. Focus came naturally. Emotional balance was accessible at will. The lessons of music patience, presence, rhythm, and awareness were internalized and woven into the fabric of daily life. Music had transformed not just mood or productivity, but character and perception. The listener realized that this journey was ongoing. Life would continue to present challenges, uncertainties, and moments of tension. But the tools, understanding, and habits cultivated through classical music provided stability, clarity, and calm. Transformation was not a destination. It was a continuous practice, one that could be returned to again and again, one note at a time. Evenings became times of reflection, gratitude, and presence. The last notes of a favorite composition would fade, leaving behind a sense of stillness and satisfaction. There was no rush to move on, no pressure to achieve or perform, only awareness of life as it was, and the knowledge that calm, focus, and peace were always accessible within. Music had taught the listener that life, with all its challenges, could be navigated with grace, patience, and joy. The story of transformation was not about external achievement or dramatic events. It was about internal growth, learning to cultivate attention, focus, calm, and emotional balance, and realizing that these qualities shaped life itself. Classical music had provided the medium, the guide, and the rhythm. It had created a framework for living, a pathway to calm, a source of enduring inspiration. By the end of this chapter, the listener had come to understand that peace, clarity, and presence were not gifts to be found. They were cultivated. Each day, each melody, and each moment of mindful listening contributed to a life that was fuller, calmer, and more meaningful. Music had transformed ordinary existence into a rhythm of awareness, focus, and joy. And in the quiet moments, as the final notes faded into silence, there was gratitude for the music, for the practice, and for the ongoing journey of life itself. The journey with classical music had become more than a daily habit. It had grown into a companion, a mentor, and a lens through which life could be understood. The listener had experienced calm, focus, and reflection, but now there was a deeper awareness. Music could teach not just peace and attention, but patience, presence, and the subtleties of human emotion. Each day became an opportunity to explore not only the melodies themselves, but how life responded to them. Mornings remained intentional. The first light spilling into the room was accompanied by gentle strings or flowing piano notes, guiding the mind into a rhythm of calm awareness. There was no longer resistance to the day, no frantic rush to accomplish tasks. Even as obligations appeared, emails, meetings, errands, the mind retained a quiet steadiness. Music had created a scaffold for daily living, a rhythm that could be carried into every task and interaction. At work, this internal rhythm proved transformative. The listener approached complex problems with clarity and patience. Deadlines no longer caused panic. Challenges became puzzles to be thoughtfully solved rather than burdens to endure. Were navigated with attentiveness and composure, and interactions with colleagues felt more meaningful. The music had taught subtle lessons about timing, pacing, and attention, which could be applied far beyond the notes themselves. The evenings were reserved for exploration and reflection. The listener discovered that different pieces influenced not only thought but emotion. Certain compositions evoked nostalgia, others inspired creativity, and some encouraged deep relaxation. Observing these reactions became a practice in self-awareness. Understanding which melodies fostered particular states of mind and how to apply them deliberately. Music was no longer passive. It was a tool for personal growth. Life outside the home had shifted too. Experiences that had once been stressful, crowded streets, loud environments, unexpected conflicts were now approached with patience and calm. The internal rhythm cultivated through music allowed the listener to remain grounded, focused, and emotionally balanced. Music had become a shield, not from life itself, but from unnecessary mental and emotional turmoil. The listener began experimenting with combining music with other mindful practices, gentle stretches, walking through quiet streets, or sitting in nature while listening enhanced focus and relaxation. Each combination deepened awareness, connecting mind, body, and environment. The melodies were no longer confined to a single room, they had expanded into a lifestyle, guiding awareness and presence in every moment. Challenges remained, as life always brings. Weeks of intense work, unexpected responsibilities, or emotional turbulence tested the consistency of the practice. But the listener had learned an important lesson. Transformation was not about perfection, but persistence. Returning to music, even briefly, restored focus, calmed the mind, and reinforced the positive habits that had been cultivated over time. Each return strengthened resilience, emotional balance, and the ability to navigate life with calm awareness. In addition, the listener discovered the joy of live performances. Experiencing music in person revealed subtleties and energy impossible to capture in recordings. Vibrations, acoustics, and the shared experience with an audience amplified the emotional and mental impact. It was a reminder that music was not just a personal practice, but a living art form. It's capable of creating connection and inspiration beyond the individual. The listener also began sharing music in subtle ways. Playlists were created for friends, gentle recommendations offered, and occasional conversations about compositions inspired curiosity in others. Some friends adopted the practice, finding calm, focus, and reflection in their own lives. The ripple effect was unexpected but meaningful, reinforcing the idea that personal growth could extend quietly into the lives of others. Every day, life became richer through awareness and reflection. Ordinary moments, making tea, observing the sunset, walking to the store, were enhanced by music and attention. Life was not easier, nor were responsibilities diminished. But the listener now experienced these moments with presence, curiosity, and appreciation. Music had transformed perception, showing that richness is found not in circumstances, but in awareness. Over time, the listener noticed a subtle transformation in character and perspective. Patience became more natural, reactions more measured, and empathy deepened. Music had influenced not just focus and calm, but the way the listener perceived people, interactions, and the flow of life itself. It was no longer a tool for temporary relief. It had become a foundation for living intentionally and meaningfully. The ongoing journey was marked by observation, practice, and reflection. Each composition, each listening session, each moment of mindfulness was a step toward deeper understanding and balance. Music had taught lessons in timing, rhythm, attention, and emotional awareness that extended far beyond the notes themselves, shaping the listener into a calmer, more focused, and more present individual. Even in quiet moments of solitude, the listener felt the ongoing effects. Music had become a guide for reflection, helping process thoughts, emotions, and experiences with clarity and compassion. The mind, once scattered and restless, was now trained to notice, respond, and balance. Stress could still appear, but recovery was faster, and calm could be accessed at will. Life had not changed externally, but internally. Transformation was profound and lasting. The journey with classical music had become deeply ingrained in daily life. The listener now understood that this practice was more than a source of comment, was a lens through which the world could be experienced more fully. Each day offered opportunities to observe, reflect, and respond with patience, clarity, and presence. What had begun as a casual experiment had grown into a consistent guiding force shaping thought, emotion, and perception. Morning routines were no longer rushed or reactive. Instead, the day began with intention, often accompanied by gentle piano, flowing strings, or soft orchestral melodies. These early notes established a rhythm of calm and focus that carried into the day. Tasks that once caused stress, emails, reports, obligations, were approached with clarity and composure. The mind moved steadily rather than frantically, and energy was directed thoughtfully rather than scattered. At work, the internal rhythm cultivated by music transformed experience. Problems that previously felt overwhelming were now approached with patience and creative insight. Deadlines were met without panic, challenges were solved with clarity, and interactions with colleagues became more attentive and meaningful. Music had taught subtle lessons in timing, pacing, standard, and awareness skills that extended far beyond listening and into every aspect of life. Evenings became moments of exploration, reflection, and personal growth. The listener experimented with different compositions, observing how each influenced focus, creativity, or emotional balance. Slow, gentle pieces encouraged reflection and release, while more dynamic compositions inspired energy and productivity. Awareness of these effects created an intimate understanding of the mind's responses and allowed the listener to navigate emotions and attention deliberately. The effects of music extended into social life. Patience and attentiveness improved interactions with friends, family, and colleagues. Conversations deepened, conflicts were approached calmly, and empathy became more natural. Music had taught that transformation was not just internal, it extended outward, subtly influencing behavior and relationships in positive ways. Challenges remained, as life inevitably brought periods of stress, emotional turbulence, and unexpected demands. But the listener had learned resilience through music. Even brief listening sessions restored calm, focus, and clarity. This practice reinforced the understanding that growth and balance are cultivated over time, not achieved instantly, and that's small. Consistent actions produce lasting transformation. Live performances became a source of awe and inspiration. Experiencing music in person revealed subtleties and energies impossible to capture through recordings alone. The vibrations of instruments, the nuances of performance, and the shared presence of an audience created immersive experiences that enhanced emotional depth and reflection. Music had become both a personal sanctuary and a connection to the larger world, reminding the listener of the richness of human expression. The listener also shared music thoughtfully with others. Curated playlists, gentle recommendations, and conversations about the impact of music inspired curiosity and engagement in friends and colleagues. The ripple effect was subtle but meaningful. Others began to incorporate music into their own routines, finding calm, focus, and reflection through the same melodies. Transformation, it seemed, was contagious when shared gently and intentionally. Everyday life became richer and more mindful. Simple actions, making tea, observing the sky, walking through quiet streets, were enhanced by awareness and music. Ordinary moments were transformed into opportunities for presence, reflection, and joy. Life had not necessarily become simpler, but it had become fuller, more textured, deeply satisfying. Over time, the listener observed a profound shift in self-awareness and emotional regulation. Patience, calm, and attentiveness became habitual, even in moments of stress. Music had influenced not only focus and productivity, but character itself.
Mastering.
Empathy, compassion, and emotional intelligence. It was no longer just a tool for relaxation. It was a framework for living intentionally and meaningfully. Reflection became a daily practice. The listener would sit quietly, allowing melodies to guide thoughts and emotions. Music offered a mirror, reflecting patterns of stress, focus, creativity, and calm. Observing these patterns deepened understanding of the mind and the self, reinforcing the ability to respond rather than react. Life was approached not with anxiety or haste, but with awareness, intention, and appreciation, even in solitude. The effects of music were profound. It provided companionship, guidance, and emotional balance. The mind, once scattered and tense, was now trained to move with clarity, calm, and focus. Stress no longer dominated, creativity flowed more naturally, and presence became accessible at will. Music had created a foundation for living that was both stable and flexible. Reliable yet adaptable to the inevitable uncertainties of life. The listener realized that this journey was ongoing. Each day offered new melodies, experiences, and insights. Music remained a companion, a guide, and a teacher, offering lessons in rhythm, patience, and emotional balance. Transformation was not about perfection or escape, it was about consistent engagement, mindful practice, and the ability to return again and again to a source of calm and focus. By now, the listener understood that peace, clarity, and presence were cultivated through repeated practice, reflection, and awareness. Life continued to bring challenges, obligations, and moments of stress, but the internal tools built through music provided stability and resilience. Each note, each composition, reinforced calm, focus, and intentional living. Music had become a lens through which life was experienced fully, richly, and meaningfully, even as the final notes of the day faded. Leaving silence behind, the listener felt gratitude for the music, for the lessons it taught, and for the ongoing journey of life itself. Calm, focus, and presence were no longer fleeting. They were cultivated states, accessible through the simple, human act of listening, observing, and engaging with the world intentionally. And in this practice, life felt not only manageable, but deeply rewarding, rich, and alive.